What if I told you that while Red Bull are trying to build their future without Honda, they may have just made a move that proves they still cannot fully leave Honda behind? And at the same time, one of Max Verstappen's teammates has just gone through a terrifying race day health scare that ended with him passing out after a stint behind the wheel. These are two very different stories, but together they say a lot about where Red Bull's wider world is right now. One side focused on technical survival, the other showing just how brutal elite motorsport can be even before the biggest events of the season begin. Let's start with Red Bull, because this is the kind of quiet development that could matter far more than it first appears. We all know Red Bull and Honda built one of the most successful partnerships of the modern Formula One era. High between 2019 and 2025, they won at the highest level and turned that relationship into multiple world championships. But once the 2026 era arrived, Red Bull moved in a new direction. They chose to produce their own engines, while Honda moved on to Aston Martin. On paper, that looked like a clean break. In reality, it clearly was not that simple, because even after a works partnership ends, Formula One teams still have to think about testing, development programs, and how they use older machinery. And that is where this reported new deal becomes important. Under Formula One rules, teams can run testing programs with cars from previous years, but there is one major catch. Those cars still need the right engines to function properly. You cannot just take an old chassis and bolt in a completely different power unit as if nothing changes. And the package was designed around a specific layout, and in most cases, that original engine architecture matters. And that means Red Bull have a problem, because once the Honda partnership officially ended, those engines did not simply remain sitting there as free-use Red Bull assets forever. If Red Bull wanted continued access to older Honda-powered machinery for testing of previous cars, then some kind of agreement was always going to be necessary. And now, according to reports, that agreement may finally be in place. The story is that Red Bull and Racing Bulls have reportedly struck a new deal with Honda that would allow both teams to continue running tests with their older cars over the next 2 seasons. If that is accurate, then this is more than a technical footnote. It gives Red Bull continued access to an important development tool while they keep moving through the early phase of their new in-house engine era. And the timing matters, because Red Bull may be building for the future with their own power unit program, but that does not mean they can instantly replace every part of the structure that came before. If they want to keep testing older machinery in a meaningful way, they still need the old hardware ecosystem to function. This reported agreement basically buys them time and continuity. It also highlights something else. The transition into becoming a full power unit player is not just about what happens on a race weekend. It affects how you test, how you train, how you prepare drivers, and how you keep one part of the program connected to another. And that leads to the really interesting part. According to the report, Red Bull and Racing Bulls would not be able to run that kind of old car test with their own Red Bull Ford 2026 engines until 2028. So even though the new engine era has already begun, there is still a gap before the entire system fully lines up in the way Red Bull would probably want. That is why this Honda link still matters. Because for now, even as Red Bull try to write the next chapter of their identity, they may still need Honda to help keep parts of the old chapter alive. Now switch from the technical side of Verstappen's world to the human side, because the second story is much more personal. One of Verstappen's GT teammates has just gone through a brutal health scare during race preparations, and it sounds genuinely nasty. The driver was part of a lineup competing in the opening round of GT World Challenge Europe at Paul Ricard, which also serves as preparation for the upcoming Nürburgring 24 Hours. The team finished ninth, but that result was nowhere near the main story. The real story was what the driver had to fight through just to make it to the finish. According to the update, he had been dealing with food poisoning during the week. That alone would be rough enough for any normal person. But in motorsport, especially in endurance preparation, there is no such thing as normal physical effort. The body is already under huge stress before you add illness into the mix. And despite that, he still raced. That is what makes this so shocking. He reportedly lost fluids, barely slept, still got in the car, still completed his stint, and then, after that effort, his condition collapsed badly enough that he ended up back in the medical center for several hours. At one point, he said he completely passed out. Just stop and think about that for a second. This was not a lazy weekend or a minor off day. This was somebody dragging himself into a race car while seriously compromised, pushing through one of the hardest stints he had ever done, and then physically crashing after the job was over. That tells you a lot about what this level of racing demands. Fans see the result sheet. They see P9. They see a classification. But what they often do not see is the physical damage, the dehydration, the lack of sleep, the pressure to perform anyway, and the mentality it takes to go out there knowing your body is already waving a red flag. And in his own words, and the experience became a reminder of resilience, of what you are made of when things go wrong and you still have to deliver. That is the part that will probably resonate far beyond this one event. Because whether you are looking at Verstappen's world through Red Bull's technical planning or through the people around him in GT racing, the same pattern keeps appearing: pressure, adaptation, and survival. On one side, Red Bull are reportedly making quiet but necessary moves just to keep key parts of their testing structure alive during a major engine transition. On the other, one of the drivers in Verstappen's wider racing orbit has just shown how punishing this sport can be even away from the Formula One spotlight. So the big takeaway from all of this is simple. Red Bull's world is moving on multiple fronts at once. There is the political side, the technical side, the long-term planning side, and then the human side. The part where real people are still pushing themselves to the limit just to stay competitive. And sometimes, the biggest stories are not always the ones that happen on a Sunday afternoon in Formula One. Sometimes they happen in the background, in a testing agreement that quietly reveals how complicated an engine transition really is, or in a recovery room after a driver gives everything he has left and his body finally says no more. And those are exactly the kinds of stories that tell you what this sport is really made of.